The late October wind howled through Cedar Street, a quiet row of weathered clapboard houses in Savannah, Georgia, where Spanish moss draped ancient oaks like ghostly curtains, and the air carried the faint sweetness of jasmine undercut by the damp rot of the nearby Savannah River. Fog rolled in thick and heavy, muffling the buzz of streetlights that cast feeble, wavering glows across the cracked pavement. Detective Marcus Holt, a grizzled man in his late 40s with a weathered face and a knack for seeing through lies, stood outside number 112, his raincoat slick with mist, the collar turned up against the chill. A call had come in at midnight, urgent and fractured, from Mrs. Evelyn Porter, the neighborhood's self-appointed watchdog, whose voice trembled as she repeated, "It's not right, Marcus. Not right at all." Those words clung to him, sharp and heavy, like a warning carved in stone. He adjusted his hat, the brim dripping, and approached the house, its sagging porch groaning under his weight. The windows were dark, save for a faint, flickering glow in the upstairs bedroom, like a candle fighting to stay lit. Officer Lena Ruiz, a young cop with a quick mind and a nervous habit of chewing her lip, met him at the door, her uniform damp, her eyes avoiding his. "It's bad, detective," she said, her voice low, barely audible over the wind. "You'll see." Holt stepped inside, the air thick with the musty scent of old books, mildew, and something sharper, like copper left too long in the rain. The living room was a cluttered shrine to a bygone era, ornate brass lamps with frayed cords, a chipped china cabinet filled with dusty teacups, a faded velvet sofa sagging in the middle. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant creak of a floorboard somewhere above, as if the house itself was restless. Ruiz led him up a narrow staircase, the walls lined with sepia-toned portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to track his every step. Holt felt the weight of the neighborhood watching, curtains twitching across the street, whispers already spreading. Cedar Street was a place where everyone knew everyone's business, where neighbors shared recipes and gossip but guarded their secrets like buried treasure, letting them fester behind locked doors until they burst free. In the bedroom, lit by a single flickering candelabra that cast long, dancing shadows across peeling wallpaper, lay the body. Margaret Dunn, a 53-year-old librarian who lived on Cedar Street her entire life, was slumped in a creaking rocking chair by the window, her head tilted back, her eyes half open, as if frozen mid-gaze at the fog-shrouded street below. Her cotton nightgown was pristine, her hands resting limply in her lap, but her face was pale, her lips faintly blue, a thin trace of foam glistening at the corner of her mouth. No blood, no bruises, just an eerie stillness that felt meticulously choreographed, like a scene from a play where the curtain never fell. Holt knelt beside her, his knees popping, his eyes scanning the room with practiced precision, a glass of red wine on a mahogany side table, its surface undisturbed, a faint ring of condensation around its base, a leather-bound journal open to a blank page. Its edges yellowed, and, tucked into the journal's spine, a single pressed flower, a wilted magnolia petal, its creamy white edges curling inward like a dying flame. He lifted it carefully with gloved fingers, its faint, cloying scent still clinging despite its decay, and felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine. The petal wasn't just a keepsake, it was a marker, deliberate and out of place. "What do we know?" he asked Ruiz, who hovered by the door, her lip already raw from chewing, her notepad clutched like a shield. "Mrs. Porter found her," she said, her voice unsteady as she glanced at her notes. "She checks on Margaret every evening, says she's been off since her brother, Tom, died last year in that car accident. Tonight, she heard scratching." Scratching? Holt's brow creased, his fingers pausing over the petal, the word jarring in its oddity. "Yeah, like nails on wood, coming from inside the house." She thought Margaret was moving furniture, maybe dealing with pests, but when she knocked, no answer. Used her spare key, came in, and found her like this. Holt stood, his mind churning, the pieces of the puzzle scattered but starting to take shape. A locked house, a dead woman, and a sound no one could pin down. It was a mystery that both intrigued and unsettled him, like a riddle whispered in the dark. He checked the window, locked tight, the latch rusted shut, no sign of tampering. The door had been secure when Mrs. Porter entered, the key still in her possession, its teeth worn from years of use. "Who was she?" he asked, his voice steady but probing, cutting through the room's heavy silence. "Margaret Dunn, worked at the public library, kept to herself. Neighbors say she was kind but distant, especially after Tom's death. Always in her garden, tending those magnolias, Ruiz said, nodding toward the petal, her eyes flicking to the evidence bag in Holt's hand. Holt's gaze lingered on the flower, its presence gnawing at him. Magnolias were Savannah's pride, their blooms heavy and fragrant. But this one felt wrong, too deliberate, like a signature left for him to find. He slipped it into the evidence bag and turned to the coroner, Dr. Samuel Tate, a wiry man with a perpetual grimace, who was adjusting his gloves with a scowl. Cause of death: poison, likely, Tate said, his voice clipped, his eyes narrowing as he studied Margaret's face. The foam, the cyanosis, it points to something fast-acting, probably a neurotoxin. No external injuries, no signs of a struggle. I'll need lab results to confirm, but I'd bet my pension on it. Holt nodded, his gut twisting, the word poison landing like a stone. Poison meant intent, someone close enough to slip it into her wine, someone she trusted enough to share a drink with. He stepped back, his eyes catching a faint scratch mark on the floorboard near the rocking chair, like claws or a knife dragged in haste, barely visible in the dim light. Someone had been here, moving carefully, leaving only whispers of their presence. A ghost in the room when Margaret died. He headed downstairs, the staircase creaking under his weight, and found Mrs. Porter in the kitchen, her hands wringing a dish towel into knots, her eyes darting like a trapped bird's. The kitchen smelled of chamomile tea and wax polish, the table's surface scarred with decades of use. Holt sat across from her, his broad frame filling the chair, his presence calm but commanding. "Tell me about the scratching," he said, his voice soft but firm, his eyes locked on hers. Her fingers tightened on the towel, her knuckles whitening, her voice barely above a whisper. It was sharp, like something scraping inside the walls, not like rats, though I told myself it was. I heard it last night, around 11 p.m., thought it was coming from her bedroom. Margaret hated pests, always complained about them, set traps in her garden. When I came by tonight, it was quiet, and her voice broke, her gaze dropping to the floor, her shoulders trembling. Holt leaned forward, his tone gentle but probing. Did she have visitors? Anyone new on the street? Not lately, Mrs. Porter said, but her hesitation was palpable, a crack in her composure. She kept to herself after Tom died. Didn't trust many folks. But there was a man. Saw him a few times, late at night, standing by her gate, just watching. Tall, always in a gray coat, never came close, like he was waiting for something. Holt's pulse quickened, a thread of the case pulling taut. Did you get a name? No, but he wasn't local, she said, her lips pursing, her eyes narrowing as if the memory left a bitter taste. Too stiff, too careful, like he didn't belong on Cedar Street. Holt thanked her and stepped outside, the fog thicker now, swallowing the streetlights' glow until the houses seemed to float in a gray sea. Across the street, a single light burned at number 114, where Victor Hayes, a retired history professor, lived. He'd moved to Cedar Street a year ago, shortly after Tom Dunn's death, and kept odd hours, his porch often littered with stacks of old journals and empty coffee mugs. Neighbors whispered about his late-night walks, his habit of scribbling notes under a flashlight's beam. Holt made a mental note to visit him next, but lingered on the sidewalk, his eyes scanning the row of houses. Cedar Street felt alive, its silence a facade for the secrets pulsing within its walls, each window a potential eye, each door a locked vault. At the station, Holt spread Margaret's file across his cluttered desk, the overhead fluorescent lights buzzing like a swarm of insects. Single, no children, no criminal record. Her social media was non-existent, her life a quiet orbit around the library and her garden, where she cultivated magnolias with an almost obsessive care. But a detail caught his eye, a $5,000 withdrawal from her savings 3 weeks ago, listed vaguely as personal expenses. He cross-referenced it with neighborhood reports, which detailed complaints about odd noises at number 112, scratching, footsteps in the alley, even a faint floral scent drifting through open windows, reported by multiple residents. One neighbor, A retired nurse at number 110 had noted the scent as like magnolias, but wrong, too sweet. The magnolia petal haunted him, its presence too deliberate to be a coincidence. He sent it to the lab, requesting a rush analysis, and ran it through their database, finding a match to a rare hybrid, Magnolia grandiflora sable dash, grown only in private gardens, not commercially available. Its pollen was unique, traceable, a breadcrumb he couldn't ignore. His phone buzzed, snapping him back to the present. Ruiz, her voice tight with urgency. The wine glass? Laced with a neurotoxin, odorless, fast-acting, enough to kill in minutes. We're still testing the journal for prints, but there's something else. A partial fingerprint on the glass, not Margaret's. Holt's jaw tightened, his mind racing. Someone had sat with her, shared a drink, and watched her die, leaving a trace they couldn't erase. He grabbed his coat and headed to number 114, the fog now a heavy shroud, the wind carrying faint whispers of the river. Victor Hayes answered the door, a wiry man in his 60s with silver hair and eyes that gleamed with too much curiosity, like a predator sizing up prey. His living room was a maze of bookshelves, the air thick with pipe smoke and the unmistakable scent of magnolias from a vase on the mantel, its blooms fresh and heavy. "Heard about Margaret," he said before Holt could speak, his voice smooth, almost too polished, like a rehearsed line. "Tragic loss for Cedar Street. You hear anything last night?" Holt asked, watching his hands, which rested calmly on a leather-bound book, its cover embossed with botanical sketches. Hayes lit his pipe, the match flaring briefly, casting shadows across his angular face. "Just the wind. I was up late, reading, lost in my work." "Scratching?" Holt pressed, stepping closer, his boots scuffing the worn rug, his presence filling the room. Hayes' fingers paused, the pipe halfway to his mouth, a flicker of tension crossing his face. "No," he said, his tone clipped, too controlled. "Nothing like that." Holt's eyes caught a gardening journal on the coffee table, open to a page about magnolia hybrids, with detailed notes on their cultivation. His heart thudded, but he kept his face neutral, years of interrogations honing his poker face. "Mind if I look around?" Hayes hesitated, his gaze flicking to the journal, then back to Holt, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "Go ahead," he said, his voice tight, his fingers curling slightly. Holt moved to the shelves, scanning titles, botany, toxicology, Savannah's colonial history, even a treatise on rare poisons. Tucked behind a heavy volume on plant alkaloids was a small vial, its label faded but legible, extract of nerium. Oleander, a plant with magnolia-like flowers and a neurotoxin so potent a single drop could kill. His stomach churned, but he didn't touch it, noting its position for the warrant he'd soon request. "You knew Margaret well," he said, turning to Hayes, his voice low, laced with accusation. Hayes puffed his pipe, the smoke curling upward like a serpent. "We talked gardening, shared a love for magnolias. She was particular about her flowers, almost obsessive. Enough to share wine with her?" Holt asked, his eyes locking on Hayes, searching for the crack he knew was coming. The professor's composure faltered, his fingers tightening on the pipe, the bowl glowing faintly. Before he could answer, a sharp thud erupted from the backyard, like wood splintering under force. Holt drew his gun, his senses snapping to high alert, and caught a glimpse of a figure through the window, tall, in a gray coat, vanishing into the fog like a specter. He bolted outside, Hayes shouting behind him, but the figure was gone, leaving only a crushed magnolia petal on the wet grass, its edges torn. Holt bagged it, his pulse pounding, and turned back to Hayes, who stood in the doorway, his face pale, his hands trembling. "Who was that?" Holt demanded, his voice cutting through the mist, sharp as a blade. "I don't know," Hayes said, but his eyes screamed a lie, darting to the side as if expecting the figure to reappear. Holt cuffed him for questioning, his gut telling him Hayes was a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture. He called for backup, the fog swallowing the sound of approaching sirens. At the station, Hayes held firm, denying involvement, his lawyer arriving within the hour to Stonewall. But his gardening journal told a different story, meticulous notes on oleander extraction, Margaret's daily routines, even a sketch of her house with entry points marked. Holt dug into Hayes' past, finding a connection to Tom Dunn's death. A car accident ruled suspicious, but never solved. with brake lines tampered but no conclusive evidence. Margaret's journal, now at the lab, hinted at her suspicions, cryptic entries about Victor's lies and Tom's truth, suggesting she'd confronted Hayes about her brother's death. The man in the gray coat was a loose end, a shadow Holt couldn't pin down. He sent the crushed petal for analysis, the lab confirming it matched the rare, sable, hybrid from Margaret's garden, but its pollen carried traces of soil unique to a private estate on the city's edge. The estate belonged to Leonard Crane, a reclusive botanist who lived at number 116, 2 houses down from Margaret's. Holt drove to Crane's house, the fog parting like a curtain as he approached. The house was a Gothic relic, its windows boarded, its garden overgrown with magnolias that seemed to glow in the moonlight. Crane answered the door, a tall man in his 50s with sharp cheekbones and a gray coat hanging by the entrance, its hem damp with mud. His eyes were cold, almost amused, as he said, "Detective, I expected you sooner." "You were at Margaret's," Holt said, his hand near his gun, his voice flat but unyielding. Crane smiled, his teeth glinting. "She was asking questions, digging into Tom's death. So was Hayes. They thought they could expose us." "Us?" Holt's voice was sharp, his senses on edge, the word ringing like an alarm. Crane's smile widened, his fingers brushing the coat's sleeve. "You think Hayes acted alone?" A faint scratching came from the attic, like nails dragging across wood, slow and deliberate. Holt's gun snapped up, his heart pounding, the sound eerily familiar. "Who's up there?" Crane's face hardened, his calm cracking like thin ice. "You're too late, detective." Holt didn't wait for permission. He pushed past Crane, climbing the attic stairs, the scratching growing louder, more desperate, echoing the sound Mrs. Porter had described. The attic was a cavern of shadows, lit by a single bulb swinging from a cord. In the corner, bound and gagged, was Sophie Porter, Mrs. Porter's daughter, a 28-year-old journalist who'd been missing for weeks, presumed a runaway after a fight with her mother. Her eyes were wide with terror, her wrists raw from struggling against the ropes. Holt freed her, radioing for backup, but Crane was gone, the back door swinging open into the fog, a faint trail of magnolia petals leading into the night. Sophie's story, gasped out between sobs, unraveled the truth. Crane and Hayes were partners in a black market trade, selling rare plants and their derived toxins to collectors and criminals. Tom Dunn, a chemist, had stumbled onto their operation while consulting for a local university, threatening to expose them. His accident was their solution. But Margaret's suspicions made her a target. Sophie, investigating her uncle's death for a freelance piece, had gotten too close, forcing Crane to silence her. She'd heard the scratching, a coded signal between Crane and Hayes, misheard by her mother as rats. At the station, Sophie's testimony tied Crane and Hayes to 3 murders, including Margaret's. The wine was laced with oleander, its toxin extracted from Crane's greenhouse, delivered by Hayes during a neighborly visit. The scratching was their communication, a tap on shared walls to coordinate movements, mistaken by Mrs. Porter for pests. Crane was caught days later, hiding in a coastal town, his gray coat stained with magnolia pollen, his greenhouse raided for evidence. But the case wasn't clean. Holt returned to Cedar Street, the fog lifting but the air still heavy with secrets. Neighbors avoided his gaze, their curtains drawn, their whispers louder now, tinged with fear. Mrs. Porter, grieving her daughter's ordeal, mentioned a detail that hadn't surfaced. Margaret had received a letter a month before her death, and signed, warning her to stop digging. Holt found it in her journal, tucked between pages, its ink smudged but legible. "Leave the past alone, or join Tom." The handwriting didn't match Hayes or Crane, suggesting a third player, someone who'd watched from the shadows. Holt dug deeper, pulling records from the library where Margaret worked. A name surfaced, Abigail Reed, a part-time archivist at number 118, a quiet woman in her 40s who'd lived on Cedar Street for a decade, unnoticed amid the neighborhood's dramas. Her house was modest, its garden sparse, but a search warrant revealed a hidden room behind her pantry, lined with files on Cedar Street's residents. Tom, Margaret, even Sophie. Reed was no bystander. She was the operation's silent partner, handling logistics, forging documents, and sending warnings to keep victims in line. Holt confronted her at dawn, the streets silent, the oaks looming like sentinels. Reed opened the door, her face calm, her eyes betraying nothing. "You've been busy, detective," she said, her voice soft but laced with steel, a teacup in her hand steaming faintly. "You sent the letter," Holt said, stepping inside, his hand near his gun, the air thick with the scent of chamomile and something bitter, like crushed leaves. Reed smiled, setting the cup down with deliberate care. "Margaret was stubborn. I tried to save her, but she wouldn't listen. And Tom?" "Sophie." Holt's voice was low, his eyes searching her face for the crack he knew was there. Reed's smile faded, her fingers twitching. "Collateral," she said, the word cold, final. A faint scratching came from the basement, softer than before, but unmistakable. Holt's gun was out in an instant, his pulse racing. "Who's down there?" Reed's composure shattered, her eyes darting to the basement door. "No one," she said, but her voice trembled, betraying her. Holt descended the stairs, the scratching growing louder, a rhythmic tap like a plea. In the basement, chained to a pipe, was a man, Peter Lang, a botanist reported missing from Atlanta 6 months ago, his face gaunt, his fingers raw from scraping the walls. He'd been their supplier, sourcing rare plants until he tried to quit, earning a prison in Reed's basement. Holt freed him, calling for backup, but Reed was gone, her car peeling out of the driveway as sirens approached. Lang's testimony sealed the case. Reed orchestrated the trade, using Hayes' knowledge and Crane's plants to build a network that spanned the South. Margaret's death was a warning to others, her magnolia petal a taunt, a symbol of their control. Reed was caught a week later in Charleston, her teacup laced with oleander, a suicide before she could be questioned. Cedar Street settled, but Holt felt the neighbors' eyes as he left, their whispers now a chorus of guilt and fear. Back at his desk, he stared at the magnolia petal, now in evidence, its edges brittle. The case was closed, Crane and Hayes charged, Reed dead, Lang recovering. But a final note in Reed's files nagged, a coded entry, buyer X, Savannah, November 15th, a date 2 weeks away, linked to a new shipment of oleander. Holt lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward, and knew the whispers of Cedar Street were far from silent. Somewhere, another petal was falling, another scratch waiting to be heard in the dark. Thank you for being with us today. Support the channel with a like, it helps us develop. And yes, your subscription is our main motivator.